Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is have a panel discussion, and the way this is going to work is we have 4 topic areas. So the panelists are going to be Emma, Hugh, and also 2 other individuals, Keith Bowers and also Reed Noss, who I'll introduce. So I think everyone should just come to the stage now. Yeah? And what I'll do is I'm going to pose to the panel each of these, so we're going to try to cover all 4 of these points. So I'm going to pose to the panel, one person on the panel, one of these issues or questions, and then the panel will discuss them. We'll see how it goes, and then you can, as in the audience, sort of be thinking about questions you want to ask or points you want to make in these areas, and we'll try to get 1 or 2 sort of audience questions in each point. So I don't know the best way to do this, but I wanted to introduce the 2 new panelists. You've already met Emma and Hugh. So here's Keith Bowers. Maybe here he is. Raise your hand. Keith is a landscape architect and wetland scientist who has been at the forefront of applied ecology, land conservation, and sustainability for nearly 3 decades. He is a founder and president of Biohabitats, which employs whole system thinking through applied ecology to address a variety of projects on multiple scales, from site-specific river, wetland, coastal habitat restoration, projects to restore regional watershed management and conservation, to regeneration of urban estuaries. Keith has kept Biohabitats, which is his company, at the vanguard of ecology and design. Anything else you'd like to add?
That's good.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah? Oh, okay. We're going to have an announcement.
Hi, very sorry to interrupt. There's a red Honda parked outside, and there's a clipboard in it, and it says Amanda on it. It's about to be towed. So if there's anybody named Amanda with a red Honda, please move your car outside. Thank you. Sorry.
That is important. We don't want Amanda to lose her car. So the next person on the panel is Reed Noss. Reed is a Provost Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Central Florida and President of the Florida Institute for Conservation Science. He has served as Editor-in-Chief of Conservation Biology and has been President of the Society for Conservation Biology. He is an elected Fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science. He has more than 300 publications and 7 books. His latest book is Forgotten Grasslands of the South, Natural History and Conservation. Reed, anything else you'd like to add?
I'll just add that I've kind of been billed as the academic on the panel,
yeah.
But I want to point out that only about a quarter of my career I've been a full-time academic. More of it I've been a naturalist and a conservation practitioner.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining the panel. Okay, so the hope here is to get some dialogue and discussion among the panel, and again, you can add your questions or points, so get those ready. So I'm going to start with Keith and ask this question or pose this point. What value, if any, do pre-European landscape conditions have for establishing targets for conservation or restoration in North America?
All right, well, I think the point that was just made in the previous presentation about historical fidelity, and not necessarily that we want to be restoring back to the past, that we certainly want to be restoring to the future. And I think ecological restoration over the past probably 5 to 10 years has moved from thinking about restoring to the past to restoring to the future. That historical fidelity is the information that we can get from looking to the past is still critical and still vital. And I still think that we need to make sure that whatever type of restoration or conservation initiatives that we're looking at, that really the past is all we have to go on. That's the only, sort of true analog besides trying to model the future, and we know how tricky modeling can become in the future. So I do think that there's a reason to look back in the past and to look at how ecosystems function, look at ecosystem processes, look at patterns, look at composition, and take that information and learn from it to apply to future conditions. So I do think that there's importance in doing that.
Good. Other comments from the panel? So just chime in freely.
Well, I agree with Keith. I think it is still of great value to have these snapshots of historic conditions, you know, from the General Land Office all the way through observations of early explorers and naturalists and so on. But I think the problem is when we make false assumptions about what those data represent and how they might be used for management and restoration. If we assume that these particular conditions, this snapshot in time when the first white guy showed up in the landscape, represent some, you know, primeval static condition that we have to get back to and keep it that way, that's obviously wrong. But on the other hand, information from those surveys is valuable. What I like to do, instead of looking at the snapshot, is try to figure out the evolutionary environment in which the species we have now in an area developed. And this requires that we look not at a snapshot, but at the span of time of evolution that may go back from thousands of years to millions of years. It'll be different for different species, obviously, and we won't know much about most of those species. But we can have a good idea about from adaptations that species show to, for example, fire regimes, to various moisture levels, edaphic substrates, and so on. We have a pretty good idea about what these species require and will continue to require into the future.
Other point? Yes, go ahead. Other points?
I just think it's, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think it's really just a matter of time before we come up with some really snappy new description for restoration that doesn't sound like we're always going back, because the word restoration implies that. And I have been working on it, so if anyone has any good ideas about what we should call it that doesn't sound too hubristic, like engineering or something, we don't want that. You know, we want something that is appropriately humble.
Well, I think the Society for Ecological Restoration modified its definition of that. I think the definition is okay. I guess we could come up with a new word, but I think that we could do that for everything. Like, we talk about speaking English, but we don't. We speak American here. You know, so I don't know that we want to continue. I get lost when people start changing the names. I just wanted to make a couple of points from the standpoint of, again, managing for this. One is that I think that, again, I think we're in violent agreement here about most of this stuff, and that there's no question but that historical information is of really, really key importance. So one of the things is that, although I think it's probably not a reasonable endpoint, if you will, kind of where we think we want systems to end up in the end, I do believe that for a lot of ecosystems, that kind of information might provide what you might call a waypoint. And the reason I say that is, I'll use just, again, this is a tired old example, I know, but it's one I know well, and this is sort of this fire-suppressed, logged forest that we manage a lot of in the western U.S. And a lot of the historical information we have points to systems that were dominated by drought and fire-tolerant species. Well, that sounds familiar. We're looking at maybe more drought in the future, more fire. You know, knowing how those systems worked is key, but also understanding just some of the structural implications of those differences. They were much more open, you know, they were dominated by larger trees. Some of those components have a lot to say for the probable sustainability of an ecosystem in the future. And so it also, managers, to make anything happen on the ground, they kind of have to have a picture in their head, at least that's the way we do it today, of what it might look like. And so I think in some cases it can be sort of a target for the short term, like, let's try to get this way, then maybe we can feel better about just letting some things happen. Maybe drift is cool now. That's that resilience management. Secondly, I think the other thing you can do is a lot of this historical work we've done, it may not be appropriate anymore for the place, like, you know, GLO data or any of these historical surveys we have from the beginning of the 19th century, or the beginning of the 20th century rather. They may not be apropos to, you know, place X in the landscape, but given changes, you know, that landscape might now be found 500 feet higher on a south-facing slope now rather than a north slope. You know what I mean? And so you can sort of translocate these a little bit geographically. So then the final thing I wanted to say is with respect to historical information, I think, and this is a real huge forward movement in restoration and in historical ecology, is our ability to mine the very distant past for information. And there is a huge amount of new information in the scientific literature where people are using information from millions, tens of millions of years ago, because we're developing tools to do that. And if you go back that far in the record, you can find places that have climates that are as warm or have as much CO2 as we're likely to have in the future. So.
Great.
It's a tiny, tiny little coda. Just listening to the talk that we heard this morning about the natural history that we heard from Guy Denny, the more you learn about the history, the more you realize how kind of contingent and random it was. Here you have a little boreal relic, and here you have a little relic from the Atlantic Ocean, and you know, it makes you realize that these places that are so dear to us are also accidents of history.
So we have a couple minutes here. If the audience wants to weigh in, or if anyone has a question, now's your chance on this topic. Go ahead.
So historically, a lot of our reserve networks, like the Research Natural Area Network and the Forest Service, have used a representative approach, and the goal was to represent the range of vegetation types or habitat types across national forest lands, for example. But given this drift towards novel conditions and the migration of species out of natural areas now, what should our conservation targets be?
Well, one response to that problem, that the vegetation is changing and a representative reserve network based on vegetation may not be appropriate, is to base one more on geophysical conditions or geoclimatic type of conditions. And so even though the species shifted around these various habitats over time, if you maintain these physical habitat, the physical habitat's substrate, then you still will achieve the ultimate goal of representation, of maintaining all species in a network. But I think, and this actually relates somewhat to the point that Hugh made. If you look back at the fossil pollen record, for example, over tens of thousands to even millions of years in some cases where we have records, you'll see that, I mean, some of these species go way back and have experienced dramatic changes in climate over time, and yet they still persist, or at least a closely related species. You can often just get the genus with the pollen data. But these species have adapted to these changes, and I think often we think about, you know, the current threat of climate change as something really new. It's not that new in the evolutionary experience of most species.
Right.
What is new is that we've modified the landscape, and species can't shift across a fragmented landscape as well as they could across a more continuous landscape. But representation, again, if we maintain all the habitats and try to connect them, it gives us a better shot.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, so now I want to move to the next point, and I will now ask Reed, or propose it to Reed to start us off. Should conservation and restoration activities be tailored to proactively address climate change? It's on the same point. And can we prudently incorporate practices such as assisted migration into management philosophies?
Okay, well, as has already come up, and as all speakers have noted, connectivity across landscapes is critically important for adaptation to climate change, because apparently more species responded to past climate changes by shifting distributions than by evolving new adaptations or physiologies in situ, although we don't have as good a record of the latter. So there may have been more of that than we think. And connectivity is, in fact, the most commonly mentioned adaptation strategy in the literature on climate change adaptation. With a fragmented landscape, we don't have that connectivity, and that's where the issue of assisted migration comes up. Now, I don't believe that the Toria taxifolia example that both Emma and Hugh referred to is really an example of assisted migration. We have no evidence at all. In fact, it's highly unlikely that Toria ever existed in North Carolina. In fact, virtually impossible. And it's highly unlikely that it would get there on its own, even without landscape fragmentation. So what we're talking about there is really an establishment of an experimental population out of the rust disease zone, which is the major threat to Toria, not climate change at this point. My colleagues and I have been dealing with conservation and adaptation strategies for species in Florida that are vulnerable to a combination of climate change, sea level rise, and land use change. And there's a lot. In fact, we looked at over 300 species that are vulnerable to these threats. Many of these are coastal paradoxically, because Florida's coastline has changed so much over time with sea level fluctuation, paradoxically, most of our, or a great proportion of our endemic taxa are on either current coastal positions or former shorelines. Okay? Presumably, then, those older taxa, and many of them are old, as far as we know, there's monotypic genera and so on, have moved landward and seaward with the shifting sea level and coastline. Now there's all this development in the way. So we are proposing, actually, my colleagues and I, assisted migration as one of the strategies to keep in mind, if we can find the right places to move them to, for these coastal taxa that can no longer migrate inland with rising sea level because of all this urban development in the way. Yeah. And so across these short distances, I think, again, if we can find the right spots, I don't think assisted migration poses a particular threat. It's very likely that they have been there before during past high sea level stands. And so we're not talking about moving species hundreds of miles. Now, when we do move species into areas where they've never been recorded historically and may not be able to ever get to on their own, I don't know if that really, if we can justify that, except for the case of, like Torrio, establishing an experimental population outside of the current threat zone.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Just go down the panel, I guess, maybe. Emma?
Well, that seems like pretty reasonable to me. I mean, I guess my sort of self-appointed role has often been to push people's comfort level a little bit with some of these experimental approaches, but I never advocate doing anything, you know, half-cocked. You got to go carefully, do the studies, try to figure out if you can possibly predict what's going to happen. Ultimately, I just care more that these species continue to persist than that they persist in their historical range. So in cases where it's really, clearly a decision between extinction and moving them outside their range, I've got no problem with moving them outside their historical range.
I want to make one more point, if I would, just before we leave this. And Hugh, maybe this is what you were going to say anyway, but
I hope so.
If so, I don't want to cut you off. One thing that has to come up, I think, when we talk about climate change and species persistence is this concept of climate refugia or microrefugia, areas that experienced historically a low velocity of climate change and now contain a lot of endemic taxa because of that. I think identifying these sites, which tend to be hotspots of endemism and species richness, is absolutely critical. It has to be one of our priorities for dealing with climate change. And sometimes these are entire regions that change very little, that were relatively stable, like, again, paradoxically, the southeastern coastal plain of North America, where vegetation has changed relatively little going back to the Miocene. And also there are microrefugia, like algific slopes in the driftless area of Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota, where we have these ice caves under the surface and these talus slopes that keep these slopes cool, and we have reliction species from the Pleistocene there that will presumably make it through even this global warming period because they made it through, it appears, the last interglacial. And so maintaining these areas, protecting them is an absolutely critical priority.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that I think there's a lot of learning that we can do. I mean, apart from our personal opinions and apart from the policy decisions that end up getting made by management agencies or whatever, or the policy sort of stance they end up taking, that this is going on anyway. The Torrey is a great example of that. The fact that there's going to be golden land tamarins in people's backyards all over the East Coast is another example of that, right, here pretty soon. And then another one is a great example is where it already has been happening. I don't think people understand the extent to which it's been happening, but we're learning from it, is just economically valuable conifer trees. They've been getting moved all over the planet forever. Some of them have turned into huge pests, others have not. And right now in Western North America, there's movement going on, particularly in Canada. British Columbia has got a big program, and they're moving stuff all over the place. Now, mind you, it's under somewhat experimental conditions still, but what a learning opportunity, So I think for where it is being done, we have to take advantage of that to learn as much as we can.
I add to that, yeah, and horticulturally as well. There's some great studies about what people plant in their gardens and how people have sort of home gardeners en masse, emergently and unwittingly, have been moving a lot of species north sort of slowly over time. because everybody else wants something new to plant in the garden, and you know, as those hardiness zones start to creep up the continent, what you're able to do expands. And I just really hope that somebody takes advantage of that natural experiment and really studies how these things are faring in these backyards.
I think everybody's comments pretty much covered this. I just want to add that I think connectivity, again, going back to Reed's beginning statement, that connectivity is a huge, important issue that we need to be spending more time and energy and effort on. And in a way, that is assisted migration by reconnecting some of these fragmented habitats that we have out there. And so I think that, you know, whether it's road crossings or whether it's just putting additional lands in conservation to reconnect some of the protected lands that we already have, in many ways that is assisting migration of some of these species, and probably in a way that will be a little bit more predictable and maybe a little less destructive or disruptive in terms of moving species outside of their range. And I also think that we need to come up with, if not a regional policies, but national policies on this, because if every one of us are doing different things in different regions, then collectively I'm not sure we're really going to get there. And I think that we need more of a national approach or a North American approach in terms of what we're doing with assisted migration and connectivity.
Just one thing I want to remind everyone, though, that that the fragmentation issue is probably the overwhelming one, but there is one other issue that has to be taken into account, and that is the relative rapidity of the changes that are happening right now. We don't really see those very often, at any rate, in the geological record. I think the more we look into the past, the more we realize that now and again there have been really rapid shifts in temperature. They have happened. But you know, the speed, even in connected landscapes, is going to make it very difficult for large seeded trees, for example, to be able to track the changes, or at least seems like it will.
Yeah, especially when the mastodons that used to disperse them are all gone, you know?
Right.
So we might have to be mastodons for the Osage orange and stuff like that. And I just want to do a plug for these novel ecosystems because they make super cheap corridors, right? Because you don't have to do anything with them. So if you have got some gnarly old weed patch to the north of your protected area, start thinking about protecting that gnarly weed patch.
Okay, Tom, we have a couple minutes. If folks in the audience have questions or you want to pose something on this topic, go ahead.
The one issue is that, and I think you just alluded to, the idea that we have other organisms that disperse seeds. If you look at the rate at which oaks have returned northward after the end of glaciation, it's faster than I can think of in any other way than having things like passenger pigeons do it. Yeah. And the corridors are important because you have other organisms just other than just the one that's moving, going with it. So don't just think humans are being the ones doing all the moving.
Other questions or points from the audience? Yep, go ahead.
How confident are you folks that the monitoring of the efficacy of efforts such as assisted migration will be just as robust as the actions themselves? And if there isn't the commitment to monitor the results, should the assisted migration be done at all?
Well, so I'm not that confident based on what I've seen in terms of monitoring for restoration in general out there. So hopefully that monitoring will play as equal or more important role in assisted migration moving forward. I think it goes back to making that shift to adaptive management, right? From static management to adaptive management. And embedded in adaptive management is monitoring, is learning. And if we aren't doing that, then it really isn't adaptive management. So if we are making that shift toward an active or passive adaptive management approach to managing these natural areas and ecosystems and assisted migration, then monitoring and assessing that data and learning from that and reapplying what we've learned to the landscape has to be a critical component there.
So yeah, I agree that there's a bad track record here for monitoring, but it's possible that the sort of scariness of assisted migration will make people slightly more willing to spend the money on monitoring. It's also possible that the kind of geeky excitement that the public might have for the sort of, if you do a kind of a big assisted migration of a mammal or something like that, I can imagine that you could probably outsource some of your monitoring to an interested public that might be able to help you with that.
Can I say something real quick? I think that's a really important point, and I'll just note that I think in the management agencies we understand the importance of monitoring, but under budget constraints, which are nearly an annual thing anymore, it tends to be one of the very first things to lose funding. And that's lamentable and maybe even tragic in a lot of situations. I mean, I think of, and this isn't an agency issue, but a cultural issue, just generally, that you think about, again, just to get back to invasive species, whether you think species X is a problem or not, but a lot of those were introductions, and if people had just tracked what was going on, we would have caught them, but we didn't, and now we're dealing with the repercussions in the long term. So I think from the standpoint of the agencies, the agency I work for and the other agencies that do similar business, it probably is going to require some retooling a little bit of a cultural change and an understanding, and being able to make the case to Congress, actually, which may be the most important thing, that kind of spending of public tax dollars is really, really important.
Okay, so I will pose the next. Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Go ahead.
In thinking about fragmentation and connectivity in terms of conservation and whatnot, we've been focusing this morning on spatial connectivity, but I also am thinking this morning too that there's temporal fragmentation and whatnot and processes whereby vegetative or sexual propagules of native species are lost from the site over time, and so I'm just thinking that assisted migration, or what traditionally I might call artificial regeneration, should not just be thought of as exotic species being moved outside of their range, but in probably a more common context of restoration. It's the artificial regeneration of native species whose propagules have been lost from that, and maybe in natural modes of migration are either disrupted or would take too long for them to get there. Or even if they got there, the environment is not right for them to germinate and assume dominance in the system, and they need our assistance in that. So just trying to expand our thinking of connectivity issues and assisted migration in that sense. That's my only comment.
Yeah, good point. And I just do another plug for this great Dayton or Five Rivers Metro Parks NUTS program, which kind of, is a very inexpensively gets those propagules coming in from all these places they wouldn't be able to get into, crossing these big highways and these built up areas in little kids' hands and plastic bags. So there's fun ways to do it too.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question will go to Emma, which is, if natural area managers were to embrace a novel ecosystems approach, sort of releasing some of the pre-European ideas or whatever, how will they go about then setting priorities for habitat protection or restoration?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I wanted to point out that when, in your talk, you talked about resist, guide, and accept, and I talked about Greg's other work where he said, restore, innovate, and observe, but they're really very pretty much, resisting is restoration and guiding is innovation and accepting is observation, right? So there's sort of the same approach. And I guess the way that I think of novel ecosystems coming into play is in that last category where you just actually do more observation and less intervention. And so it's harder to set goals for that kind of management approach because you really don't have any idea of where the system is going to go. So your goals are really that you learn, and also that you preserve wildness, that you preserve autonomy as a kind of as an ecosystem process, if you like. So that's how I see it coming into play. I certainly wouldn't suggest that we do this everywhere, obviously, because think about the conservation-reliant species that are out there. If we just take our hands off, there's a lot of species that would go quite quickly. So we're going to have to, the sort of paradox, I think, of the 21st century conservation is that you have to intervene more and intervene less. And what's going to kill us is the mushy middle, where we're sort of half-assed, half-intervening, because we've got a lot of different people leaning on us as managers, and half of them are saying, this is a designated wilderness, you shouldn't be doing this, and half of them are saying, the white bark pine is going extinct, you need to be doing something, and half of them are saying, you're spending too much money. You know, so, and what you end up with is some kind of policy that doesn't really go either way. It doesn't truly give you wildness, and it doesn't truly give you species protection. So what I'm really advocating for is divide up the landscape between different strategies, but when you pick a strategy, commit to it and do it. If you're going to innovate, go for it, be bold. And if you're not going to manage, really don't manage. Just go home, watch TV.
Can I just ask, just follow up on that? I mean, it's not my job to do this, but I just want to say it sounds like almost like a wilderness philosophy. It's like the Wilderness Act for a roadside ditch. Like, is that what you're saying? You're hands off in the roadside ditch. Is that right?
Kind of. I mean, you know, because I see, you know, there are certain landscapes that we don't want them to change. They're just too important to us emotionally. And so a lot of those are designated as wilderness, but we're going to have to really manage them to keep them looking the way that we want them to look. So, you know, it's like a mitigation. So for every wilderness area that you're actually managing the heck out of, let's have an area that we don't have as much emotional attachment to, that we actually don't manage, that actually does go wild. And it'll be really interesting to see in another 2-3 generations which of those areas is now called wilderness by our grandchildren.
So one of the things I wanted to say, and I don't know if Emma really meant to say this, but I would not recommend letting them go and then watching TV. I would, first of all, stay away from TV. It's a bad thing. But or whatever it is, whatever those things are called now. But I would say that what you want to do is watch that ecosystem that you decided to let go, because there's a whole lot of things, and actually it's probably a lot cooler than TV.
Yes.
A little slower moving, maybe, a little slower moving. Hopefully it's more slower moving. So I would say that actually, although I think from kind of in Emma's notes there, I think she was referring mostly to, you know, sort of more urban, semi-urban environments, and I just want to note that really, given where everything's going and given the novelty of the current Earth's atmosphere, we don't have any non-novel ecosystems anymore, just about. I mean, it just depends on how you define them, all right? I don't want to get into semantics, but what I just simply want to, how I want to translate that is that really on the federal lands as well, even in big landscapes, we're managing novel ecosystems, and we're going to be managing a lot of them in the future, because we are not going to actively be able to do a whole lot about these changes on pretty large parcels of land. So I think, again, a definition thing came up here about, you know, what would you call wilderness, say, in the future? Well, I think that how you define nature and how you define what you want on a landscape will probably have to change, right? And some of those things are, I think all of us talked about these things. The idea of, like, right now when we think about a landscape, we think about the way it looks, right? A structure, certain group of species that we really like or that we have some connection to. You know, Reed noted how we needed to get away from representative ecosystems maybe and talk about representative biogeochemical entities, places on landscapes. And so I think a enhanced focus on ecosystem services, on the presence of important functional groups. You know, do we continue to have soil on the site? Are there hydrological processes happening, right? Is there soil formation happening? You know, that sort of stuff. We may need to start to back off from some of these species and photo-specific kinds of things and think a little bit more about processes. And when you do that, I think you end up kind of where Emma wants us to go, which is you're willing to accept a little bit more change in the landscape, and you might not freak out about it. There was another point I wanted to make that was germane to that, but I've forgotten it, so I'll pass the mic.
Well, I think that, again, going back to if each individual land manager is all of a sudden going to decide that they have a novel ecosystem and they're going to try to manage that from a habitat and restoration standpoint, then the first question should be, well, what biodiversity would I potentially lose in doing that? And where does that biodiversity exist in other places? So it goes back to, again, a larger context than just the area that you're managing, and saying, okay, from a regional or ecosystem perspective, are there other areas that are preserving or conserving that biodiversity that will allow me then to manage this from a more novel ecosystem standpoint? Or do I really need to fight this idea of novel and try to preserve or conserve that biodiversity in the area that I'm managing. So I think, again, stepping back and looking at it from the 30,000 foot level and looking at the site and looking at the areas you're managing and what's happening regionally, contextually around you is really important in making those decisions.
Well, first, and I'll be brief, but I think the novel ecosystem approach has been overhyped a bit. I think if we look at it over a sufficient span of time, any ecosystem or community at any point in time is a novel ecosystem, because these species are always shifting distributions. Things are changing, the climate's changing. It's just a question of the rate of change. And again, with some of these climate refugia that are referred to, the rate's been apparently very slow for a long period of time. Other communities have changed very rapidly. As far as past climate change, I was looking recently at a couple of years ago, but there's records of sea level change on the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, which has been very stable in terms of tectonics. There's been no significant uplift or subsidence for a long period of time. Sea level was rising there on the order of 4.5 meters per century during several periods since the last glacial maximum, for example, around 13,000 years ago. And in some of those centuries, it may have been literally on the order of more like 9 meters. I mean, it's way over anything that's been forecast for the next couple centuries. And sea level is kind of the best barometer of global heat. And so we know there's been periods of very rapid climate change, even since the last glacial maximum. And there's evidence now that the last interglacial came on extremely rapidly, around 125,000 years ago. Maybe more rapid than any climate change we're seeing now. And this gives me some comfort, really, that we may be able to find a way to help nature adapt to these changes. And it may involve, as we've talked already, some assisted migration and some restoration of connectivity.
Good. Okay, let's let the audience weigh in some. Yep, go ahead.
You've been suggesting what to do and how to choose for different areas. But from my experience, the problem is tied to continuity, in that a person leaves a job, a person retires, a new person comes in, they have different priorities, or there are budget cuts, and ideas shift. It's not just what ideas should be implemented, it's how do you get anybody to stick to it. And Reed, we're still waiting for you to get back to your photo stations here in Ohio.
I need to do that.
Well, I think one of the things is the way that government entities deal with it and institutions is through policy development, right? So you get a policy and some ways of implementing it, and that should theoretically live across the lifespans or periods of work for different individuals. But as you know, and as you made clear, the reality is that as someone leaves a position and the new one comes in, there are different nuances, and that makes a big difference in the way management happens. But I think, I don't know if there's a panacea for that. I think that really it does come down to policy development, though, and some really, really important questions about how do you develop policies to things that you don't know where they're going. You know what I mean? And so it's almost that you have to develop more ways of doing business than specific policy statements about what you think about them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you brought up a really big problem. I think, on the one hand, we have the inertia of bureaucracies where they just don't want to change. Then we have this internal change, often related to politics, that makes otherwise very valid and solid management and monitoring programs just totally fall apart. With a change in leadership, a loss of money, and so on. And I really don't know how to deal with that. It's something that I've seen my whole career, and it's ugly, and I don't know what to do about it. But maybe more volunteerism, more involvement of the public, as Emma referred to, might be a way to solve some of these problems. And we have seen an increase in that, really. If you think about it, over the last few decades, there's more and more, Friends of the Parks groups here and there. I mean, I go to a state park in Florida now, and we charge admission to state parks in Florida as well. But there's virtually no paid staff. They're all volunteer Friends of the Parks people. On the one hand, this is kind of depressing, because where are the jobs for these new generation of natural rights professionals? But on the other hand, the money apparently, politically, the money isn't there. It could be, but it's not. And so it's a good thing that we have these volunteers out there doing the job.
And this brings up an interesting point, which is how I justify what I do for a living, which is that if you're going to have volunteers and the public collecting data for you and helping you out, you need to explain to them some of these more, seemingly odd management strategies. We need to bring them up to speed with what it's like and what challenges are and what some of the possible approaches are in a changing world. Many, many wonderful tree-hugging members of the public are all very still much looking for a classical restoration approach. And so there's some education that needs to happen.
I agree. Go ahead.
Noxious weed lists that are sometimes inclusive of native plants as well as maybe very invasive plants seem to impact a lot as to what homeowners can do with zoning or schools can do if they let habitats grow up and create these wild places that might be more accessible to children. And also it seems to be a dichotomy between if the land is identified with an owner, if it's truly abandoned or no one knows who owns it, it can be wild more easily than a land that's identified with somebody who can receive that complaint. So I want to know if you think that these noxious weed lists have a place in management anymore in the country. A lot of them are agriculturally based, I think. And also, is there any place in the country that has gotten a grip on that and has either changed those rules or come to some kind of consensus that we can look to as a model?
I think this essentially presages question number 4, which was going to go to me. So I'll say a few things, although I don't work really directly with noxious weeds, except maybe in some of the ecological consequences of some of those things. And I don't know that, I think that in all cases, there probably are tweaks that can be made to the way that governments and societies deal with threats like that. You know, all of those noxious weed lists and the way that they're implemented probably could be done different ways in some places. They still have a heck of a time catching some pretty noxious stuff that shows up and that people end up planting. And I'll just say that I don't know that there's really a better way to do it. I think we're really lucky that we've got those lists, and that in the end, the question that was going to be asked to me had to do with triggers, right? Which is kind of what you're asking. You know, when is there an issue, right? And when do we all decide there's an issue? Well, right now there are invasive plant councils and people working in invasive plants and pests, and they're the ones trained in this stuff, and they're the ones who have the best idea as to whether or not a species that might be introduced is a real, could be a big economic issue or could be an escape issue. And I don't really know how else to go about doing that. Do you guys have any better ideas? I would say that I would be really scared if we got rid of those entities. It would scare me to death.
Some plants are native plants that maybe agricultural folks don't like, but they're great habitats.
That's right.
Yeah.
You can't grow those either.
Yeah, so I was going to speak to a little bit of zoning on that. I mean, I think some of these policies can be tweaked so that if you're not in an agricultural area, you know, some of those rules can apply to you. I know that I had a picture of my own crazy backyard. I would have loved to have not mown at all, but there was the city of Columbia, Missouri would have cited me for not doing that, which cracks me up, given that it probably was a tall grass prairie before, and now if you have tall grass, you're illegal. So, I mean, there's certainly in kind of more residential, suburban, industrial places that are not agricultural, I think that there's room for some policy changes so that you can stop mowing your lawn or kind of create a more natural area without running afoul of some of these rules. But I'm sometimes a little too blasé about weeds, so it's one of my failings.
And I do know that there are, as Hugh said, there are invasive plant councils that are looking at that more from a natural area standpoint than from an agriculture standpoint, and that some states and some jurisdictions within states are changing policy or changing laws to accommodate that.
Yeah,
so.
here in Ohio, I was talking to Ryan, right? And here in Ohio, you're on this, not the invasive species board or whatever, and there's no economic considerations there.
Yeah, the way we identify invasive plants, in particular, is our protocol doesn't include economic issues, but some other states do. So there's a sort of a patchwork right now.
Yeah. I have seen on some of these on lists of pest plants, not only native plants, but native plants that are labeled as exotic pest plants.
Yeah.
An example, it's an anecdote, but from Florida, several years ago, I was watching a presentation by a paleoecologist who was interpreting Florida's fossil pollen record. And tens of thousands of years ago, there's pollen of Pistia, water lettuce. I don't remember the species, but it's a monotypic genus, so it doesn't really matter. And this is an archaic, relic species. It's pantropical, just one species. And it goes way back, and yet it's listed by our Exotic Pest Plant Council in Florida as a Category 1 invasive. And there might be an economic reason for this because it does clog waterways, along with true exotic plants like water hyacinth and hydrilla. So I'm wondering if some of this mislabeling does have an economic source behind it.
Right.
Well, I think, again, I'm not an invasive plant or species expert, but I would note that, again, this gets right back to the whole human desires and human needs thing. And you're getting into muddy terrain here right now, because whether a plant is native or exotic, oh boy, okay, number one. Number two, is it a problem or is it not a problem? Oh boy, there's another big issue to talk about. And it's going to depend a lot on people's values, where they are in the economy and society, where they came from and all that stuff. And these things have to get worked out in the public with as much information as you can possibly get your hands on, and in every case there will not be enough information. Anyway, yeah. There was a question I saw back there. Oh, Eric.
Yeah, one thing that worries me about embracing novel ecosystems across large parts of the landscape is kind of a loss of diversity. So what I'm worried about is strong climate drivers and with habitat fragmentation is that a lot of individual sites may converge with dominant species that are good at dispersing, that are generalists in terms of climate. And it seems like each individual site might have a lot of societal values, but over a region it seems like maybe losing diversity.
Can I respond to that? Yeah, Eric makes a really good point here, and I actually wrote a couple papers on that issue decades ago. But basically, you can have an increase in diversity at a local scale with invasion of not only exotic or non-native weeds, but also native species that are opportunistic and thrive under human disturbed conditions. And so on a local or even landscape scale, you might see an increase in species richness and think, oh, this is a great thing. But if you broaden your spatial scale of observation to the region and to the globe, what happens is you're losing the sensitive native species that can't cope with these changes. So the overall global effect is biotic impoverishment, which Hal Mooney pointed out in a book chapter in that biodiversity book that Ed Wilson edited back in 1986, I think it was, and everybody's kind of forgotten about that. But it is quite possible that every site of similar climate around the world could end up dominated by the same set of cosmopolitan weeds if we push this concept of novel ecosystem to its logical conclusions. And I agreed with almost everything Emma said in this talk, but the one thing about non-native species increasing diversity locally is the one thing that I would be very worried about, because that could lead to regional and global impoverishment. You're right.
Well, as soon as you name check me, I better respond. I absolutely agree that homogenization problem is a real issue, and that's why you can't just not manage the whole earth, because you'll lose those sensitive species. That's why you need the mix of approaches, and you need to manage some areas specifically for those sensitive species that are not going to be part of this little club, of this little Cosmo club. But I also do think that it's unlikely that we're going to see 100% identical systems in Hawaii and Central America and the Pacific Island. I still think that there's going to be surprises. Yeah, we might see a lot of Cecropia and we might see a lot of Tree of Heaven, but I do still think that there's going to be diversity. But there will be some species that are not going to be on the frequent flyer club, and we'll just have to manage those. With a different set of tools. That's why we have to do my diversity thing, right?
Other panel comments? Questions? Go ahead.
Well, I think, as I said, if anybody else has broken the planet, it's pretty obvious that what we're talking about here is that we're in a period of experimentation already, where we say, what happens if we don't spend money to do management, and what we get, or what happens if we allow landscapes writ large to be dominated by things like
none of us want to touch that. So I'm going to take a shot at it. Because you're thinking the same things that all of us are thinking in the room, and the answer is that there are no answers at that level at all. So don't give me a thumbs up, it should be a thumbs down. But I just wanted to just put a couple things in perspective. One is that I just think that given the scale of the issues we're talking about, that it's highly likely that most landscapes that we treasure won't get any, or at least not a whole lot, of direct attention. Okay? That's just what's going to happen. I don't think we can get around that, all right? So given that that's going to happen, I think that what a lot of us have said here, I think almost all of us, well, forgive me, I'm speaking for people, but there's a lot of value in trying to learn about what's going on. And we're in a really dark room. We don't even know where the walls are. We don't know where the light switch is on a lot of this stuff. But you got to work your way along the wall to find that light switch, you know? And if you think about the way that humans learn, how do we learn? We largely learn experientially by actually doing things. And secondly, humans learn mostly through unexpected outcomes, not expected outcomes. So what it says is that unless you're willing to actually try stuff and to experiment with things and to risk failure, that you're not going to learn anything in the long run. So that's one thing that I would say, all right? So whether or not we're actually actively doing things, if we're not using this opportunity to learn a little bit more, because the one thing that we've got above all the other species is we can actually pass knowledge on, right? From beyond generations, right? The other thing I wanted to note too, and this is a thing, I was a geologist by training originally. And so I think in a lot of these broad scales, and you know, we're entering this new age of extinction probably, or we already are there. And I think a lot of us are really depressed about that, and impoverishment and homogenization of landscapes and all those things. I think that we should try as much as we can with an open dialogue and as much information as possible to make differences where we can make differences, right? But I always fall back on something Stephen Jay Gould said before he passed away. And he was kind of an irreverent guy, okay, so take it for what it's worth. But you know, he had this really long-term perspective. He was a historical geologist, right? He worked in very long periods of time, a paleontologist, and he would say that people were always, because you know, he was all about this extinction thing, and this is the new extinction. But people would say, okay, so we really need to get you on board with this whole environmental movement thing. And he would say, wait a minute. He said, I think in really long time scales. And he said, you know, humans, we're making a lot of mistakes and we're mucking stuff up. But in the end, all this stuff is in our eyes because the Earth is going to survive. And after, remember, all species go extinct. And after we're gone, there'll be this amazing diversification of crazy stuff. And I am so mad I'm not going to be around here to see that stuff. So you know, this is before he died of asbestosis, right? Very young. And so I don't mean to suggest that these are not huge problems. They are giant problems. But we have to remember that really in the end, well, I don't want to say they're human problems. There's a lot more at stake here. But we're causing a lot of the problems, and we're the only ones who can try to devise solutions for them. But I don't think, even though it's a very depressing scenario, that we should let ourselves get down about it.
Yeah, and I just absolutely add to that that if, you know, we teach our children to despise what is happening to the land so that they become alienated from it, then that will be the end of conservation. So the land will change, but our children will have to love that land even as it changes. There's just no other option.
And I agree with that, and with both what Hugh and Emma stated. And I would furthermore add that I've begun to learn more and more from my doom and gloom days as an early conservationist, younger conservationist, that, you know, those gloom and doom messages don't work very well to inspire people. You know, even they may be true. I mean, we are probably going to lose half of all species on Earth over the next couple of centuries. That's a bummer. And you know, I think, you know, as Gould noted and Hugh quoted, in the end, nature will rebound. But you know, we look at the mass extinctions of the past. It takes 10 to 20 million years. So yeah, he's not going to be around. No one here is going to be around to see that. And I furthermore think that, you know, there's something to learn from, really, Darwin talked about this in Descent of Man. Aldo Leopold talked about it, other authors, that even though, yeah, nature bats last, if you will, we do have some ethical obligation to treat other living things with respect, in part because they're our kin. So it's kind of broad sense of our family. We know from evolution that we're related to everything else on Earth. So causing other species to go extinct is a moral failure of sorts. But that said, I think the key to inspiring a more optimistic, proactive conservation, keeping wonder alive and awe is through natural history, is to get kids at an early age who are inherently interested in natural history, call it biophilia, if you will, keep that alive instead of discouraging it like our technology and our teachers and parents tend to do. If we keep that love of nature and learning about nature alive, I think we'll have a positive way to inspire conservation that works much better than this doom and gloom.
Boy. My wife my wife doesn't accuse me of this. I guess I accuse myself of this, of waking up every morning and rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic in the way that we're managing the environment out there. But I would say that, 30 years or 30 plus years of practicing ecological restoration and conservation, that it is really it's not a doom and gloom message. It's about what hope we have out there for the future. And I think that's the really important message. And I think that's where sort of environmentalism has failed over the last 30 years, is because all we've done is doom and gloom and the sky's falling and we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, and instead of looking at nature for what it is and what it provides us. And I also think that we need to be more activists out there. I think sometimes we sit in a room like this and we're just sort of passive and say, well, this is what's going to happen, how do we deal with it, instead of taking a more active role out in society in terms of really champion what we believe and what we think is right. And it just amazes me at what our society, what we plow money into day in and day out there. Whether it's war, whether it's buying consumer products, whether it's Nintendo or whatever, instead of plowing money into not just green infrastructure, but living infrastructure, and how can we replenish, how can we do everything that we're doing out in the landscape to replenish life instead of degrading or diminishing life. And that's really, I think, what we need to be teaching our kids and demonstrating out there for everyone else.
Okay, I'm going to have to pull the plug now. So help me thank the panel. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you're involved in the speed networking event, that's going to happen in room 202 starting right now. And please get back at 1:30 for the concurrent sessions. Otherwise, it's a break for lunch.